There's a moment that terrifies other people when it comes to empaths. The moment you simply stop reacting. You stop answering the calls that used to pull you into late-night rescues. You stop explaining yourself when accusations come like rain. You stop lighting your own edges on fire to keep someone else warm. To the people who relied on that rescue, it looks like coldness. To Carl Jung, it looked like the decisive turn toward individuation, the final phase of becoming a whole, autonomous person. This is the shadow side of empaths. According to Carl Jung, and it is not what most people think, you don't owe anyone your emotional labor, and yet when you begin to keep your feelings for yourself, when neutrality arrives as a kind of safety, people panic. They accuse you of being cruel, distant, unfeeling. They call you selfish. They demand explanations you no longer have patience to give. That reaction is not your failure. More often than not, it's the system around you alarmed because its supply of your reactivity has dried up. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who coined the idea of individuation, noticed in his practice and writings that healing is not simply the removal of symptoms. Individuation, in Jungian terms, is the process by which a person becomes psychologically whole, integrating the parts of the self that were projected outwards, reclaiming disowned qualities, and developing a centered sense of identity that is neither inflated nor diminished by others. Jung also taught about the shadow, the parts of ourselves we reject, deny, or project onto others. For empaths, one of the most misunderstood aspects of the shadow is the capacity to detach, to withhold emotional rescue when it would cost their integrity. When that capacity is integrated, it looks like coldness to those who relied on your old pattern. In truth, it is a boundary that preserves your soul. But what is the final detachment? Why does it feel so absolute, so definitive? Many empaths do boundary work and learn to say no. They practice clearer communication and better self-care, yet they may still find themselves emotionally hooked to certain people, checking their messages, reheating old hopes, getting baited with guilt. That is partial healing, cognitive insight without full effective resolution. Final detachment is when your head and your heart align. When the intellectual understanding that a relationship is unhealthy becomes the felt reality that it is no longer energizing or necessary. It is not a sudden flipping of a switch. It is a settling, a last grief. Grief is the mechanism here. Unlike dramatic, cathartic grief that erupts in public displays, the grief that completes detachment is often quiet. It comes in small waves, a memory that arrives out of nowhere. A weekend that used to be laced with hope and now is empty. A lonely holiday that reframes a lifelong dream. This grief is the mourning of the imagined future you invested in someone else. The future in which they would change, love you fully, or finally show up. Jung recognized that individuation requires mourning the projections we've cast outward. For empaths, some of what must be mourned is not only the hurt, it's the hope that kept you engaged. Consider an adult child who spent 20 years waiting for an emotionally unavailable parent to return. The child became expert at anticipation, reading silence, smoothing tension, offering explanations. They learned to be small so the parent would not withdraw further. They learned to hope. Over time, that hope became a scaffold for their identity. If I can keep hoping, I am useful, needed, and thus safe. Partial work, reading books about boundaries, attending therapy on and off, helps the mind see the truth. But the sorrow that dissolves the scaffold comes slowly. It arrives not as a single wrenching scene, but as repeated low-grade releases. A cancelled visit that no longer triggers frantic repair, a birthday passed without stomach-sick longing, a memory that no longer contracts the chest. When the grief has done its quiet work, the person stops calling to explain themselves, stops waiting for the apology, stops leaning forward to fill the emotional void. This is the final detachment Jung observed, the alignment of feeling with understanding. Before we go deeper, if this way of exploring Jung and the psychology of the empath resonates with you, consider subscribing to the channel. This is where we continue unpacking the deeper layers of the psyche. You may wonder what this looks like in everyday life. There are behavioral markers, small and large, that signal the completion of this phase. You will stop explaining yourself endlessly. Where once you would rehearse reasons, why you left, why you said no, why you didn't answer, now you offer fewer justifications because they no longer feel required. You will no longer check social media for cues, likes, or bait. Invitations that once felt like tests become simply choices you make without performance anxiety. You will not respond to hoovering, the manipulative attempt to pull you back into an old dynamic, because the pull no longer compels you. You will practice selective vulnerability, reserving your deep presence for those who show reciprocity, not scattering it indiscriminately. Inside, you will cultivate what Jung would describe as an internal locus of control. Your emotional climate is generated from within, rather than being orchestrated by another person's moods. Imagine a vignette. Once, you'd cry at the mere thought of an ex-partner. You'd feel your pulse spike and spend evenings composing texts to repair a rupture. Months after the last attempt, you find you can recall the relationship like a book you read years ago, with interest, but no visceral need to revisit it. When the ex reaches out with manipulative charm, you don't respond. That non-response is not a cruel act, it's a boundary in motion. An assertion of psychological sovereignty. Psychological sovereignty means you steward your inner life and energy as a resource. You are not compelled to gaslight yourself into caring for what costs you peace. And yet, when you enact that sovereignty, expect fallout. Systems dependent on your reactivity, partners who benefited from your emotional labor, family members who offloaded responsibilities, friends who learned to use you as an emotional vacuum, will not always accept your shift with gratitude. What you will often see is escalation, increased pressure, intensified accusations, dramatized crises, or attempts to shame you back into your old role. People may call you cold, accuse you of abandonment, or weaponize guilt with statements like, "After everything I did for you." These reactions are not evidence that you were wrong to change. They are often a sign that you had been structurally essential to someone else's equilibrium. The pressure is their attempt to restore the familiar pattern that served them. If this reframing is helping you see these reactions with more clarity instead of guilt, take a moment to click the like button. That feedback tells me this kind of depth is worth continuing here. It's crucial to frame this escalation not as a moral indictment of those who react, but as a diagnostic signal. In systems theory, when a component stops performing its designated role, the system resists. When a boundary removes your role as rescuer, those who benefited will try to reinstate the pattern. That resistance can be messy and painful, but it can also be confirming. If your withdrawal provokes someone into manipulation, it reveals the hidden labor you had been doing on their behalf. Jung would see this as a symptom of projection, the system projecting its needs onto you rather than owning its internal deficits. You might read the phrase, the empath's shadow, and recoil. Shadow sounds negative, as if something to be exercised. But in Jungian language, the shadow is not moral badness, it's the disowned or unrecognized parts of ourselves. For many empaths, the shadow includes their capacity for detachment, but there is another layer of the empath's shadow that is harder to face. Sometimes, beneath the compassion, there is an unconscious need to be indispensable. A quiet identity built around being the one who rescues, stabilizes, or absorbs pain. If you are always the healer, you are never the one who needs healing. And that role can become intoxicating, not because you are manipulative, but because being needed can feel like proof of worth. When that identity goes unquestioned, empathy turns into subtle control, and sacrifice becomes a way of securing attachment. For many empaths, both of these capacities, the ability to detach and the hidden need to be indispensable, are difficult to acknowledge. They have long judged detachment as wrong, cruel, or unloving, because they equated empathy with unconditional self-sacrifice. So they suppressed the capacity to say no, to withhold emotional rescue, or to prioritize their peace. Integrating the shadow means reclaiming that capacity and owning it as a legitimate part of the self. When integrated, the shadow becomes a protective function, a firewall that allows compassion without compulsion. Integration shifts how compassion shows up. Previously, your compassion tended to be compulsion. You felt responsible for others' emotional states to the point of self-erasure. After integration, compassion becomes choice-based and sustainable. You can feel for someone's pain without being compelled to fix it at your expense. You can set boundaries and maintain tenderness. You become capable of selective intimacy, deep, sacramental closeness, reserved for people who demonstrate reciprocal care and capacity, rather than indiscriminately pouring out yourself to anyone who asks. This is not coldness. It is care refined by wisdom. There are small behavioral signs of this integration that you may recognize. At family dinners, where conflict used to tug at your throat, you hold neutrality instead of playing referee. You allow arguments to be what they are, without grafting yourself onto the emotional debris. When a friend attempts to provoke you into offering care that will be misused, you simply don't engage. Your absence, rather than reaction, becomes the message. You prune relationships with surgical precision, not from vindictiveness, but because your energy is finite and you must steward it. You comfort yourself in solitude and find it restorative rather than punishing. But beware, healthy solitude is not the same as permanent isolation. One of the shadows that can arise during this process is avoiding connection out of fear that closeness will mean repeating old patterns. Detachment, when untempered by reflection, can calcify into emotional withdrawal, where you bar everyone out as a defensive move. That is not Jungian integration, that is avoidance. True individuation requires both the capacity to be alone and the capacity to be with others from a place of maturity. You should be able to choose solitude because it replenishes you, not because you're afraid to risk repeating the past. The test of integration is whether you can allow intimacy without losing yourself. Let me tell you another vignette to make the grief's texture clear. Imagine a woman who spent years trying to fix a chemically dependent sister. She invested weekends, money, and emotional presence under the quiet hope that if she stayed steadfast enough, recovery would come. Years pass. Therapy helps her see the pattern, but the ache continues. Then gradually, the moments of mourning come. An unreturned text that no longer launches panic. A Christmas morning where she doesn't spend hours in anxious arranging of the sister's comfort. A quiet afternoon where she allows herself to plan a trip without feeling guilty. The grief is not a single sob. It is a series of small abandonments of the imagined future. Each one a tiny death that clears space for a real life. When she finally declines a major financial request from the sister and does so without trembling, the detachment has completed itself in behavior. Her refusal is not vindictive. It is a boundary where compassion meets economy. You may have noticed a recurring pattern in these stories, the interaction between inner change and outer reaction. On the inside, your heart must mourn. On the outside, people will try to pressure you back into your old role. This is where clarity about motives helps. Compassion is an open hand, compulsion is a leash. Distinguishing between the two is part of what Jung called psychological sovereignty, knowing where your responsibility ends and another's begins. Sovereignty does not mean you will be less loving. It means you will love without losing yourself. If you've already noticed this difference in your own life, write in the comments. Compassion without compulsion. There is also a pragmatic side to this process. Final detachment often leads to practical outcomes that feel, at first, uncomfortable. You will prune your social circle. That pruning is not about proving a point. It's an economic decision, an allocation of emotional resources. You will become more discerning in intimacy. You'll choose fewer confidants, but invest more deeply in those relationships that show mutuality. You will curate your presence on platforms and in spaces where your energy is respected rather than exploited. You might choose to limit family interactions, move living situations, or restructure financial entanglements, all as an expression of boundary rather than punishment. None of these outcomes happen on a universal timetable. That's an important caution. There is no single blueprint for detachment. For some, it happens relatively quickly after a catalytic trauma plus supportive surroundings. For others, it unfolds over many years of small deaths and quiet recoveries. Jung's point is not to offer a schedule, but to illuminate a direction toward wholeness. The variability is human. The trajectory is the essential thing. You may be thinking, if I detach, will I lose my capacity to love? That fear is understandable and worth addressing. Integration of the shadow does not eliminate empathy. It refines it. You can still feel deeply, but you're no longer compelled to fixate on reparation. You can still be tender, but tenderness will be given without the same self-erasure. Love, when freed from compulsion, becomes more sustainable because it is chosen freely and reciprocally, not demanded by old patterns of survival. Another common anxiety is the moral framing. Detachment looks callous, especially in cultures that equate empathy with non-stop caregiving. That judgment is unfair and often inaccurate. Detachment is a moral choice to protect your integrity and to refuse enabling systems that harm both parties. It is possible, for instance, to detach from a partner who weaponizes shame while maintaining openness to the possibility of reconnection if genuine change is demonstrated. Detachment can be both firm and spacious. Firm toward what is harmful, spacious toward what is humanly possible in someone who is trying. When people react by accusing you of coldness, remember this: accusations often function as an attempt to guilt you into resuming the pattern. They are emotional tactics aimed at restoring the previous equilibrium. Responding to those tactics with anger or a flurry of explanations will often simply pull you back into old dynamics. Instead, neutrality, measured not frozen, serves as both proof that you are changing and as a boundary against manipulation. And neutral does not mean indifferent. You can witness suffering without being responsible for solving it. Think of emotional energy as a limited currency. Historically, you may have spent it on subsidizing other people's emotional budgets. Final detachment is an economic recalibration. You begin to deposit your energy where it yields mutual interest and withdraw it where exploitation is likely. That economy feels thrilling for some and guilt-inducing for others. Both reactions are valid, and both belong in the grieving process. The guilt you feel is often the leftover moral code taught to you by systems that rewarded your self-effacement. The grief is the body's way of acknowledging loss, even as you protect yourself from repetition. With time, the guilt softens into discernment. There are practical signs you can watch for that indicate you're moving through, and perhaps completing this phase. You notice your phone buzzing and decide not to look. You go to a family gathering and return without replaying every interaction afterward. You respond to manipulative texts with a brief, calm boundary statement or not at all, and you do not spend hours rehearsing the perfect reply. You begin to ask yourself, who benefits from my reaction? And if you answer honestly and find the benefit is mostly to others, you begin to choose differently. This is the work of sovereignty, and it is not cold, it is conscious. A word about safety. As you detach, some relationships may escalate into attempts to provoke, shame, or even coerce you. Prepare for this without weaponizing your detachment as revenge. Escalation can be dangerous in some contexts. The goal is to protect your energy and autonomy while not escalating conflict for the sake of proving a point. Your safety, emotional and physical, must remain a priority, and you are allowed to take whatever measures are necessary to maintain it. Another caution: do not mistake stoicism for completion. If your neutral face hides ongoing inner turmoil that you refuse to name, you haven't integrated the shadow, you've merely suppressed it. True integration allows tenderness to return on your terms. If you notice chronic numbness, an inability to feel even in moments that should elicit tenderness or grief, that may indicate an unresolved wound. The difference between healthy detachment and numbness often lies in whether you can still feel compassion selectively. If you can allow sadness, compassion, and curiosity inside the boundary, you have likely integrated your shadow. If everything feels like a closed vault, more reflection is needed. How do relationships look after final detachment? They become fewer but deeper. You'll cultivate connections with people who do not require you to be their emotional caregiver. You'll enjoy relational reciprocity, people who ask for care and give it back in measures you can live with. You'll also allow relationships to have limits. Some ties will become episodic rather than continuous. That's okay. The hallmark of maturity is not the number of people in your life, but the quality of the exchange. There's a spiritual angle to this as well. Jung's individuation process has a quasi-spiritual dimension. You are reclaiming parts of yourself that once lived in the dark by owning them consciously. That process often leaves you with a richer interior, a deeper capacity for meaning, and a truer sense of purpose. You may find aesthetic pursuits, creative work, or quiet rituals that nourish you instead of frantic people-pleasing. This isn't a reward for being unavailable. It's the natural flourishing that follows the planting of healthy boundaries. Still, you should expect ambivalence. Detachment is both relief and loss. You might feel lighter and lonelier on the same day. You might celebrate your newfound peace and also miss the chaos that perversely was familiar. Jung would call this the paradox of individuation. Growth involves embracing contradiction. You are not moving from bad to good in a linear way. You are learning to hold more complexity. The grief, the nostalgia, and the relief can coexist. That paradox is a sign of depth, not confusion. Finally, remember that you do not travel alone. Many empaths go through this process and report the same eerie clarity, the strange experience of being uninterested in the dramas that once consumed them. Many also report the same external backlash, friends and family who won't accept the new arrangement and who attempt to restore the old system. Both of those observations align with Jung's clinical intuition. The psyche seeks wholeness, and the community often resists that wholeness when it threatens its equilibrium. As you face this next phase, hold a few truths with tenderness. Detachment is not coldness, it's clarity. It's not a moral failure, it's a reclaiming. Grief is not a list of things you did wrong. It's the necessary clearing of space where something new can grow. The integration of your shadow does not strip you of compassion. It refines it so you can love without diminishing yourself. In closing, remember that this moment, the moment when you stop reacting, does not mark the death of your feeling life. It is, paradoxically, the birth of a more deliberate heart. You will still mourn, you will still ache, but you will also find that your tenderness becomes an offering rather than an indebtedness. You will experience relationships chosen from wholeness, not patched together from hope. And if you stayed until the end, let me know by writing in the comments. I choose sovereignty. I'm leaving another reflection on your screen right now that continues this exploration into Jung and the shadow. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.